the image that comes in the mind of most people is not something really positive. We are reminded of no fancy stories from web series and movies, which always talk more on the negative aspects of clinical trials, how people have been duped. This is how the public perceive about clinical trials, and most of the time what you get from the media is negative images of clinical trials. And this is not restricted just to the public. I recall an instance when I was once preparing a clinical trial protocol with the professor in a clinical department. And the background of the PowerPoint presentation was black. So he told me, you please change the color to white, because as it is, people, ethics committee members are going to think something hunky-dory is happening, and you make it a black background, they're definitely not going to trust us. So this is the kind of mindset many have about clinical trials. But having said this, if you look at the last 100 years, when you talk about the lifespan of an individual, all of us know that the lifespan has almost doubled. And of course, many discoveries, inventions have contributed towards better quality of life. But among that, one of the most important thing is availability of better drugs and vaccines. And many of these have come thanks to robust clinical trials, proving that they are really safe and they are really effective. So it's so important for us to understand what are the principles behind doing good clinical trials. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a number of slides so that I stick to the time given by the chairperson, that is 20 minutes. So I'll skip certain slides. So to start with, what is the definition of GCP? It's basically a standard, okay? An ethical and scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting trials. This is so as to ensure to the public that two things are kept in mind. That is, one, the rights, safety, and well-being of the participants are protected. And number two, the clinical trial data that is generated, it's going to give you credible data. Okay, so credible results as well as patient safety. These are the two cardinal principles of good clinical practice. We ensure that a standard is in place so that this is produced. So if you look at the history of regulations, as early as the 1906, there was a Food and Drug Act from the FDA, which said that essentially medicines need to be free of any adulterants. But there was no mention about the fact that it should be safe and effective. Then we all know that there was a sulfanilamide tragedy that happened in 1937, soon after which legislation came about into existence, stating how it was important that safety needs to be proven in animal studies, and only then a drug can be released in the market. And then we all know what happened in the 1940s. The Second World War was on. A lot of unethical experimentation was done on prisoners of war by the Nazis in concentration camps. And the purpose of this projects was basically to ensure that the German troops, okay, they survived. How best to improve the survival and rescue of this German army. And some of the most unethical or cruel experiments were done on these people so as to prove their supremacy over other races. And as many as 7,000 medical experiments were documented around this times, being done largely on the Jewish prisoners of war, along with other prisoners of war. And when all this was over, when the war was over, they were able to convict only a few of these people. Many of them escaped, and some of them went on to live in other countries. And they didn't even have enough proof. In fact, one of the things that was told at the time was there is no clear-cut guidelines to say that what these people are doing is wrong. So how can you accuse us of being people who have done something wrong? So then came the Nuremberg Code in 1946, which essentially said that you have to protect the rights of individuals who are taking part in research. A set of 10 points were brought out on how research should be conducted. The gist of it is that a person should give voluntary should be able to give consent when he's participating in the study, and he has every right to withdraw, and he needs to be told what exactly is the process involved, what exactly is the procedure that is going to be done to him. And that is how the first modern code of regulations came about into existence. Then we all know very well about the Thyladomide tragedy, how drug for morning sickness caused a lot of cases of phocomelia across the world, and this drug was stopped in the US thanks to the efforts of Francis Kelsey, who insisted that more safety data brought out by the company. And as a result of this, the US government, they passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which essentially said that for marketing a new drug, there needs to be proof for safety as well as efficacy, and also that all adverse events that happen in a clinical trial should be reported, and there should be people who are qualified investigators who participated in the trial. Then came about the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which sort of emphasized the regulations brought out by Nuremberg Code. They provided clear-cut guidance as to how medical research should be done. And this has been updated several times, the last one being in 2013. And we all know about the Tuskegee syphilis study. And as a result of that fallout, the Belmont report came into existence, which again gave some more guidance as to how research needed to be regulated. Simultaneously, in India, we saw the ICMR guidelines. For the first time, they brought out the guidelines in India on how biomedical research should be done. And then we had the ICH GCP guidelines, which came out in existence in 1997. So what is this ICH GCP? It's basically a guidance document that was brought out by people who were from the pharmaceutical industry, as well as people from the regulatory countries of several regulatory authorities of several countries, the US, Europe, Japan, Australia. Many of these countries, the regulatory authorities, as well as the pharma industry, came about to bring out a common document so that there will not be too much of dyssynchrony between the documents submitted to each regulatory agency, so that it becomes easier for a sponsor to submit the documents to the regulatory authority, and it becomes easier for the regulatory authorities to have a common consensus. So this was the first kind of document which told how clinical trials need to be done. Now, if you look at the core principles of GCP, essentially it is the health of the patient will be the first consideration. So the first thing it said was clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principles as per the guidelines. So Declaration of Helsinki is one of the things that has to be followed. And apart from that, applicable regulatory requirements. For example, if a study is being done in the US soil, the US FDA Code of Federal Regulations applies. If it is done in India, the local guidelines are applicable. There is the new drugs and clinical trials rules are applicable. So sometimes you might be doing multinational studies, then you have to ensure you follow the local guidelines as well as the necessary international guidelines also. Always, it's essential that we evaluate risk versus benefit. For the amount, it's impossible to almost say that there should be zero risk. There is obviously, when you say clinical trial, it is not without risk. Risk is going to be there. But the question is, when compared to the benefits, is the risk that a person is taking, is it justified in performing a clinical trial? A trial should be initiated only if the anticipated benefits justify the risks. The rights, safety, and well-being of the trial subjects always take precedence over society's benefits. If you look at the research that happened in the 60s and 70s, particularly outside India, a lot of times there was this concept where people were told, look, it is something good for the society, so it is good that you participate in the research. So people were not able to follow that the individual was more important than the society. And that changed over the years with all these new regulations. If you have to do a clinical trial, you should have adequate justification in terms of non-clinical as well as clinical information. In other words, you should have preclinical data to justify giving a drug and testing a drug in human beings. And You don't start straight away with a large trial, a phase 3 trial, but you start by getting evidence from a smaller study and progressively increase as you are having a better idea of what you're dealing with. So in other words, there should be some information available before you embark on a clinical trial. And this clinical trials need to be clearly mentioned. There should be a protocol that guides you when you do a clinical trial. So it is not something that can be done in a haphazard manner. You should have a protocol and you should religiously follow this protocol when you start doing a clinical trial. And we all know this, that any trial, before you start the trial, the local ethics committee has the job of ensuring that the protocol is something that is acceptable. It can be done in this local population, and there are no specific social concerns besides the scientific concerns that are there in that particular area. And only if they give a favorable opinion can a investigator start a clinical trial. So two approvals, one is the local EC approval as well as the regulatory approval needs to be obtained. And even though a clinical trial will have a large team of people, that is, there is a principal investigator, there are other co-investigators, there is a clinical research coordinator, and the nursing staff. So many people are there involved to help the entire team to ensure that data is collected and generated. Now, different people are given different responsibilities, but there is one thing that has to be ensured is that if anything is related to medical decision making, that medical decision and that those medical judgments are always taken care by the physician. So a physician, a person who is doing a clinical trial, who's an investigator, he cannot do the clinical trial in absentia. He cannot just relegate that to other people, especially people who are not having a medical background when it comes to decision making about the medical care of the subject. And who can be an investigator in a clinical trial? Only someone who has an education. So if you look at in India, clinical trial can be done only by someone who's completed a post graduation in the relevant field, and he should have experience. That is why most sponsors, they look for investigators who already have some kind of experience as an investigator or a co-investigator in some earlier trial. They are very reluctant to give trials to new investigators for this reason. So because regulators insist that they have necessary training and experience in that particular disease, as well as experience in conducting clinical trial in that particular field. Informed consent should be something that is freely given. It should no one should be coerced to participate in the study. And if a person is belonging to the vulnerable population, appropriate consent in the form of audiovisual consent might be also required. And this is extremely important, that confidentiality of the records, that has to be preserved. It is possible that during a study, there is going to be a visit from the monitor, that is a sponsor, to the hospital to look at the records. So ensure that none of the subject's personal details, the participants' personal details, are shared with a third party or even a sponsor. The records are to be kept completely confidential. Now, when a clinical trial is done, the way you handle the investigational product is extremely important. Okay, one is, of course, the GMP, that the sponsor has to take care of that. But apart from that, the investigator at the site and his team should handle the IP, very investigational product, extremely carefully, because it is possible that if you do not ensure that the storage is done in the proper temperature, proper humidity, and you're storing in a place where access is not restricted, then there could be major issues happening in the clinical trial. We had a situation where there was one particular product which was stored. It was supposed to be stored between 2 to 8 degrees. It so happened that once the temperature excursion was noticed, it became from 2, it became 1 degree, and that was recorded by the research coordinator. And the subsequent visit, when the monitor came, when he saw that, he said, all of these IPs need to be returned back to the sponsor because there is a temperature excursion. Even if it is 1 degree, it is not acceptable. So this is how things are done when it comes to good clinical practice. We have to ensure that IP is handled very, very carefully. Every aspect of a clinical trial, especially a regulatory trial, the quality of that trial should be ensured. In fact, that it is, unless you have a system to ensure quality is there when it comes to data, gathering data and ensuring that the data is apt and appropriate, no, you're bound to have challenges when you're going to do data analysis. So this should be kept in mind when we plan clinical trials. So besides that, in India, we all know there is the ICMR guidelines for biomedical research in 2017 and new drugs and clinical trials rules 2019, which is essentially the guidance document for conducting regulatory clinical trials in India. And if you're talking about doing a clinical trial for a medical device, then we have to follow the medical device rules 2017, which clearly tells you what are the regulations for pivotal trial, for pilot study, okay, and which can be considered as low risk devices, which can be considered as high risk devices. They are all clearly mentioned in these guidelines. So we all know that a clinical trial is basically any study where you prospectively assign human participants to a particular health intervention so as to evaluate its effect on the health outcomes. It could be efficacy and safety as well as pharmacokinetics. And this could be either drugs, cells, biological products, surgical procedures, radiological procedures, or even point of care devices which are being used. So there are different types of clinical trials. I'm not going to go to the details of this for the sake of time, but I just want to tell you that there is something called regulatory and academic trials. And essentially, when you're saying a trial is regulatory, you are trying to say that the data that you generate from this trial that is going to be provided to the regulator for the purpose of reviewing, for the purpose of marketing. At the end of the day, all regulatory trial data is being generated for the purpose of marketing. So any trial that you're doing where the outcome of the trial is not intended for the purpose of marketing, you're not planning to submit the data to the health authorities, then it automatically becomes an academic trials. So currently, academic trials are under the purview of the local ethics committee. For academic clinical trials, there is no need to provide the get the regulators approval before starting the project. But even though clinical trials are essentially the same, what we practically see is many times the difference between academic trial and regulatory trial is something like this, what you see on the screen. So it should not be like this, even though regulations for academic trials are less, but ultimately we have to see that we implement the same ethical principles when it comes to academic trials also. Try to follow some kind of quality monitoring systems in place, have some quality checks in place, so that finally whatever output that comes from an academic trial is as good as something that comes even in a regulatory trial, even if you may not have all the resources available with you when you perform an academic trial. So coming to regulatory trials. So regulatory trials, you would see that the stakeholders are essentially the sponsor, the regulator, the ethics committee, the investigator, and at the heart of it is the patient. So they essentially, the sponsors can directly involved in a trial, or they could be involving CROs and SMOs. CROs are basically contract research organizations which do the trial on behalf of the sponsor, whereas SMO is basically an organization which is stationed in the hospital, which takes care of all the site activities on behalf of the investigator. So it takes almost 1.3 to 2.8 billion US dollars and almost 8 to 15 years to bring out one molecule in the market. So it is a tremendous investment from the sponsor, and that is why at every step there is a quality system in place to ensure that finally you're dealing with a product that is going to be in the market for a while at least. So as I told you, each ethics committee is a local watchdog which is going to ensure that this trial is conducted. First of all, it's reviewed thoroughly, and after it's reviewed, once the trial begins, it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to also monitor the progress of the trial at periodic intervals. And there is something called clinical trial registries that you all know well. And then regulator has a very key role in reviewing the clinical trial protocols as well as the data generated from every stage of clinical trial, because unless the regulator is convinced that the data is valid in terms of safety and efficacy, he is not going to give approval for the next phase of the clinical trial. So I'm going to end by just telling you what is the clinical trial process flow. So sponsor approaches with you with a feasibility questionnaire, you sign up the confidentiality agreement, and then you share the protocol or protocol synopsis is shared to the investigator by the sponsor. And once he's convinced that this protocol is something that is implementable, he signs the protocol signature page. And of course, the sponsor also should be convinced that the site can manage this particular trial. Then they also choose the site, and they select the site, and then they give the protocol. They get the protocol signed by the investigator, as well as the investigator undertaking is signed. And simultaneously, the budget is also finalized with the sponsor as well as institution. And all study documents are shared by the sponsor to the site so that the ethics committee approval can be obtained. And once the ethics committee reviews and finds it acceptable, and once the DCGA approval is obtained from the sponsor, the site is initiated by the sponsor so that the site can start recruiting potential patients, and where they provide consent and then enroll the participants. And once they enroll the participants, they randomize them, continue ensure that the follow-up activities are done, all study procedures are done, and then periodic reporting of the protocol deviation, because it's impossible to have a situation where there is no protocol deviation. Protocol deviations, if it does not occur, it means the trial is not being done truthfully. Okay, and there is going to be adverse events that will be there that has to be reported periodically. And if there is a serious adverse event, that has to be managed medically, as well as appropriate timelines reporting to the respective authorities should happen, so that if compensation they are eligible, they should be receiving it. And sponsor will be periodically monitoring it and auditing the site also. So once all these activities are done, the database is finally locked and the study closure procedures are done, and the site is ready for inspection at any time by the regulatory authorities. And simultaneously, the sponsor will get the marketing approval for the product, and our documents need to be archived at the site. So to conclude, I would just say regulations over the last few years have evolved significantly, yet gaps do remain. For example, the timelines that are claimed to be followed by the regulatory agencies are many times not followed. So many of the protocols are stuck in the DCGA office for more than the time that is expected. And ethics committees across the country also require a lot of capacity building so that they are able to really review projects at a faster pace. And on one side, they have to ensure safety of the participants, but on the other side also, the progress of science should not be hampered for reasons that are not reasonable. Need for more investigators to participate in clinical trials so that drug development process can be hastened. It's always a challenge to find good investigators who know what they're doing when it comes to clinical trials. Sponsors are always left in the lurch for this, and that is why they keep going to the same investigators repeatedly. No matter how many systems are in place, finally it is the individual. So we can have 30 regulations, but if I as an investigator or if I as a coordinator, if I don't ensure that GCP is followed in spirit, not just in letter, but even in spirit, then no amount of regulations is going to be enough. And it's also important, simultaneously, we also educate the public about what exactly clinical trials are, so that they will also be able to take up and understand trials in a better way and participate meaningfully. So thank you for a patient listening. I want to thank our team also, who has been involved in doing clinical trials with us all these years. And once again, thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share a few things about GCP.
Thank you, Dr. Melvin. That was a fantastic presentation, and I definitely agree with your thought that no matter how much regulations come into place, if you are not committed to follow the GCP in the real sense, no, it is not going to be an easy task for the regulators, neither for the investigators. May I now, if there are any questions, I would like to take a couple of questions in the interest of time. So the participants can actually type in questions if they have any questions for Professor George in the chat section. In the meantime, may I ask Dr. George a question to begin. Is Dr. George, what are the basic differences? Because, you know, many times we believe that the ICH GCP is actually the binding guideline. Do you think there are any basic differences at all between the Indian GCP and the ICH GCP guidelines?
I would say currently what is being referred to is more the new drugs and clinical trials rules. So new drugs and clinical trials rules 2019, which came out in March, it has brought out a lot of new regulations which were not there in the earlier Indian GCP. And if you see, it definitely empowers the ethics committee a lot compared to what was earlier. There earlier, many of the regulations, many of the review processes required the DCGI's approval, and only then it could be followed. But now the local ethics committee is empowered many times to take decisions on various aspects of clinical trial management. So, and similarly, in this, we are also seeing that SAE management, the way SAE review is done, there is a lot of differences in how it was earlier done and how it is done today as per new drugs and clinical trials rules. I'm not going into the details of it in the interest of time, but I think SAE management is going to be one of the sessions. So
yeah, that is going to come up in the session. So basically, I would say the Indian GCP is actually the replica of the ICH, but then definitely we are referring more to the Clinical Trials, New Drugs and Clinical Trials Act when it comes to following it for our country. Two participants have raised their hands. Can I ask our organizers to first let Dr. Nimesh Krishna ask the question? Dr. Nimesh Krishna, please. Do you want to unmute and ask the question? Hello? Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, Ji. Is there any change after the current pandemic? Is there any change? Like we had to fast forward many things, right? In the clinical trial. So is there any change in the GCP guidelines?
No, there is
after the pandemic.
No, there is no change in the GCP guidelines after the pandemic, but during the pandemic, there was definitely accelerated approval review process for clinical trials, both from the DCGI end as well as the local ethics committee. There was a separate guidelines given as to how ethics committee need to conduct themselves when it comes to reviewing protocols related to the pandemic, related to COVID-19. But there is no change in guidelines for non-COVID trials post-pandemic. As of now, that has not happened.
Dr. Sushil Sharma, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. George, I had a question for you. I really don't know whether the subsequent speakers will be tackling it, but this was about academic trials. Like as we see most of the times in our institutes, we have faculty members putting intramural projects or any other projects which are academic in nature. So what is the issue as regards to compensation? Like many times there is a possibility that however remote, some adverse effect can happen in academic trials which are not funded. The PI is not getting any funding. And if he takes up a trial and there is a issue of compensation, what exactly is the status of this in academic trials?
Okay. So academic clinical trials, this compensation issue is definitely a thorny one. It's not something, there are no easy answers for this. The only, the recommendation is of course that there should be a process in place to ensure compensation is provided. So there are only two options. One is the institution takes it up as, okay, if generally we are taking up that in case there is any issue in any clinical trial, the institution will take up the responsibility of providing compensation. This is one. This is, in theory, it is easy to say this, but almost practically very few institutes will come forward to give a blanket document stating that they will take responsibility for this. So the other option left is for the investigators to identify a process by which they can get funding for getting insurance for a clinical trial. So insurance for a clinical trial, depending on the risk of the trial, they can actually take a decision on going forward for an insurance. That insurance premium they might have to pay somewhere, but depending on the risk, somewhere between 75K to 1 lakh or something it could go, or could be higher than that, depending on how risky it is. And the ethics committee can take a call based on the risk involved in a trial. Like if it is a trial where it's clearly a product that is extremely low risk, well known over the years, then the ethics committee definitely can take a call to decide, okay, since we consider this a very low risk trial, we are not recommending, we are not insisting that you get this mechanism of insurance in place. But so finally, ethics committee has to take this call. If ethics committee feels that this is a trial that will potentially bring up SAEs and potentially patients will need compensation, then ethics committee can insist, please get an insurance done before you start the trial. So it's a call that EC can take based on the risk involved that you think a patient is likely to go through.
Thank you, Dr. George. I think we have many questions here, but in the interest of time, I'll only pick up one. I would request others. There are a few questions which will be answered in the subsequent session. There is an interesting question coming in from Dr. Shubha Matal. Surgical clinical trials do not come under the purview of NCDT 2019 or the device rules 2017. Which regulations or guidelines should be followed for these trials? Would it be ICMR 2017 guidelines which are applicable to the surgical trials? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So thank you. So currently there are only two guidelines that are in place. One is the new drugs and clinical trials rules, and then the ICMR guidelines. So if a product, if a trial does not come under the purview of NDCT 2019, it automatically will be coming under the ambit of ICMR guidelines 2017. So all surgical trials will definitely have to follow the ICMR guidelines 2017. If it is a surgical trial where you're having a device in place, then of course, and if the device is a regulatory device trial, then again you have to come back to medical device rules 2017 as well as NDCT 2019.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. George. And there are a few questions which will be answered in the subsequent session. One is a question on ethical clearance for a private investigator. Dr. Nishan, please wait for the ethics committee session. You will get your answer there. Dr. Mrinalini was asking, is this mandatory to have a PI from the relevant specialty? Not always, but then definitely you will have more sessions going ahead. With this, I would like to close the session. There are many questions to be answered. But please write to us, and I hand it over to Dr. Ganesh. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabru.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Melvin sir and Subhrajyoti sir, for a good topic. Now we will go ahead for the second talk. It will be by Dr. Savita madam. Now I request Dr. Dinesh Badiyal sir to introduce today's second speaker, Dr. Savita Verma madam.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ganesh. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Savita Verma, a good friend for a long time in pharmacology as well as in medical education. She is a professor of pharmacology at Pandit B.D. Sharma, PGIMS, Rohtak, Haryana. And she's also done fellowship CMCL Famer in 2020 and fellowship of International Medical Science Academy. And you can see many awards here, COVID-19 Warrior Award, and then Women's Achiever Award, Ayushman India. And she has been principal investigator in many clinical trials. And she also has more than 60 publications. So I invite Dr. Savita Verma to enlighten the audience.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you, sir. Now, at the onset, I would like to thank the organizers of this online workshop, the NAPT and the AIIMS Nagpur, for giving me this opportunity and honor. And in the present scenario of clinical research, it is good to have trainings in clinical research as well as good clinical practices, because if we want to ensure the safety of the participants, and if we want to ensure that we generate a good quality data, which is of international standard. So all of us are required to have training in good clinical practices. And many of us want to become principal investigators, as I saw in the chat box as well. And but not only to become an investigator in a clinical research, many of us are also members of the scientific society as well as institutional ethics committees. Now, pharmacologist is a core member of institutional ethics committees. So the various regulations and roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders of the trials or research, the information about this should be available, and we should get training in these information, because as ethics committee members, we will be required to audit and inspect different clinical trials as well as research. So with this, I'll just share my presentation. So I would be discussing about various responsibilities of investigators, sponsors, and monitors. And as Dr. Melvin has very beautifully defined, what are the various regulations which govern these responsibilities, and this have been clearly mentioned in the new drugs and clinical trial rules. So at the offset, I need to just highlight the importance of training in clinical trials. The single most important step which we can take to improve the clinical trials is to make sure that those who are doing that research are qualified enough to do it. And the agenda for today is I will identify the federal regulations and what are the obligations of investigators, sponsors, and monitor. Discuss some specific problems which have been observed during the inspections at clinical trial sites, and what are the various remedial methods which we can use to ensure compliance with federal regulations and study protocol requirements. Now, these roles and responsibilities have been clearly defined in the various guidelines, and these are some of the applicable guidelines. And like Dr. Melvin said, at present, ICMR guidelines and new drugs and clinical trial rule guidelines govern the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders. And at present, for the clinical trials, even for the academic trials, because if you go through the new drugs and clinical trial rules, in chapter 4, they have given the formation of an ethics committee for academic trials. And over there, they have also mentioned that they will be governed under the ICMR guidelines. So as such, those ICMR guidelines now also come under the Act of NDCT rules. So we need to follow the NDCT rules as well as ICMR guidelines for conducting the clinical trials and research studies in India. So these are the various stakeholders in the clinical trial environment. And let's come on to the responsibilities of these clinical trial stakeholders. Now, coming on to the first and foremost, I just like to discuss what are the various terms which we are using in these stakeholders. So who is a principal investigator? He's a person who is overall responsible for the conduct of clinical trial according to good clinical practices at a particular site. Now, if the research is being handled by a team of individuals, then the principal investigator is the responsible leader of the team. And while sponsor is an individual or a company or an institution or any organization that takes the responsibility for the initiation, management, and/or financing of a clinical trial. And we have another term which is known as sponsor investigator. So what is this term? This is an individual who both initiates as well as conducts the research. And please remember that this is an individual, not any company or an organization. And the requirements which will be applicable to a sponsor investigator would be of both, of that of sponsor as well as investigators. So we'll be discussing these responsibilities of these individuals one by one. So coming on to the responsibilities of the investigator. Now, as I said, the principal investigator is overall in charge of the conduct of clinical trial at a particular site. And if any mishap happens, then he or she is held accountable for that particular site. And our regulations do permit sponsors to delegate their responsibilities to CROs, but they do not permit principal investigators to delegate their responsibility, their general responsibilities to anybody else, be it a CRO or the team or SMOs. So the overall responsibility of the conduct of a clinical trial at a particular site lies on the shoulders of principal investigator. And these are the overview of the various responsibilities. I'll just try to handle them one by one in an easy way. And coming on to the first one is, first and foremost, how does one become a clinical investigator? So our regulations clearly define that the clinical investigator has to have some basic educational qualification. It is now mandatory to have good clinical practice training. And generally the sponsors pick the investigators based on their past clinical experience in clinical research. Plus, they have to have a protocol specific training for a particular clinical trial in which they are going to become a principal investigator. And there are certain agreements which have to be in place before the trial can be commenced, which is known as a clinical trial agreement. So this is just a copy of one of the trials of the clinical trial agreement. Now, depending on the institution from where the clinical trial is being conducted, we can have a bi-party agreement or a tri-party agreement. A tri-party agreement is between the institution, principal investigator, and a sponsor, whereas a bi-party agreement is between the investigator and the sponsor. But it depends on the institution to institution, it varies, that what kind of clinical trial agreement is there. But this is a legal document which makes it binding to all the three participants in the clinical trial. Now, another important responsibility of the principal investigator is to ensure that adequate resources are available at the trial site. Now, adequate resources can be in the form of qualified staff or facilities available. And the investigator, it is the responsibility of the investigator to ensure that there is no diversion of the adequate resources to other studies at hand. And as you can see in this picture, that we need to have a certain area where the clinical trials are conducted, where the medical management can happen. And what are the various instruments which are required for that particular clinical trial? For example, for vaccine trials, we need special storage facilities. So some of the vaccines are stored from 2 to 8 degrees of centigrade. So we need to have special refrigerators available. And then we also need to have calibration certificates available for those instruments which are being used, whether it is a weighing machine or a BP apparatus. So any kind of apparatus or resource which you are using, calibration certificate is a must, and it is a responsibility of the investigator to have all these resources in place. So, another important resource which I want to talk about is time. We cannot undermine the importance of time in a clinical research. As a principal investigator, it is a full-time job and it is a 24/7 job. A clinical investigator has always to be available for any kind of mishap or anything which happens. And whenever you are taking the responsibility as a principal investigator, you have to see that how much time can you devote to that particular activity. Because in this slide, I'm showing in the nutshell what are the various activities which are to be carried out. And a principal investigator has to be associated with all the activities throughout the study, because ultimately the responsibility lies on the shoulders of the principal investigator. Then choosing the study team. Now, this is where the acumen of the principal investigator comes into play. So if you can identify a good study team, then more than half your work is done. So depending on the kind of trial you are undertaking, different individuals are included in the study team, and you need to train all those study team members, and their curriculum vitae and delegation log have to be maintained at the site for inspections and monitoring visits. So this is a delegation log, how we maintain the delegation log of the study team members. Obviously their names are mentioned, their roles are defined, and they can only carry out those particular roles in the clinical trial. What is the start date when they became the study team member, what was the end date. So all this has to be documented, and this is part of a good clinical practice documentation. Then another important responsibility of principal investigator is communication with the ethics committee. Any activity which is happening at the site is the responsibility of the investigator and not the sponsor. So investigator needs to be aware of what are the various documents which needs to be communicated to the ethics committees, and different ethics committees at different places require different submissions, but these are the common documentations, and NDCT rules also mention these common documentations, like all written information which is to be provided to the participants, informed consent protocols, their amendments, any advertisement for recruitment of the participants, information about the payment and compensation, investigator brochure, the current CV and qualifications of the investigators and the team members. So everything has to be communicated with the ethics committees. And that at different time points, different type of communications have to be made. Like before the commencement of the study, the essential documents have to be submitted. And once the study is approved or has been given ethical committee approval, before starting the study, CTI registration, DCGI approval, and signed clinical trial agreement has to be notified or submitted to the ethics committee. And once the study has been approved, only then the study has to be commenced at the site. So during the study, different amendments to the protocol, whether they are minor, if they are minor amendments, they have to be notified. But if they are major amendments, then they have to be, approval has to be taken from the ethics committee, number one. And secondly, reconsenting might have to be done with the participants depending on what kind of amendments are being made. Communication regarding the serious adverse events, any protocol deviations, minor or major, progress reports as annually or requested by the ethics committee, whatever is the SOP of the ethics committees, premature termination of the trial. So these are some of the activities which or the documents which need to be communicated with the ethics committees during the process of clinical trials. And once the trial has been completed, then end of the study notification, final study reports, and clinical study reports, all these things have to be notified with the ethics committee. And there are certain in-trial activities. I'm just sharing the important in-trial activities, important responsibilities of the principal investigator. First and foremost is recruitment. Now, there's a challenge, and few of the studies have been done on the challenges of the recruitment. And in one study, it was noted that 86% of all US clinical studies fail to recruit the required number of participants on time. And approximately 30% of the UK sites failed to recruit a single patient. And only 70% agreed recruitment targets are met. So there can be certain unforeseen challenges when we are thinking of recruiting the participants, and the principal investigator and the study team needs to take that into account. For example, in one of our vaccine trials for COVID, one of the participants was a high-profile person, and that person got COVID 1 week after the first dose of COVID vaccine. And before that, we were getting a lot of calls for recruitment in the clinical trial. But once that news became public, it suddenly dried up. So we were not able to complete our recruitment target in that study. But then what happens is it's a competitive recruitment, and generally these are multi-centric trials. So other sites take up. So overall, it is the responsibility of the sponsor. But at the investigator side, the investigators have to make sure what are their recruitment strategies and what are the unforeseen challenges which can happen during those recruitment. So investigator has the overall responsibility, but they can also delegate that workload to the team members of the committee. So the purpose of the recruitment process is to identify the potential participants, and we can also advertise for the potential participants. But whatever advertisement you are making, it has to be approved from the institutional ethics committee. And recruitment is followed by enrollment. And in the enrollment process, once the participant has been recruited in the study, consenting has to be done, screening of the participant has to be done, and you have to randomize and then give IP. So what are the activities which happen in enrollment? The first and foremost activity which happens is administration of the informed consent. Now, this is the overall responsibility of principal investigator, but this responsibility can also be delegated to some team members, like those who are medically qualified persons or sub-investigators of the study. And needless to say, we'll be having a full discussion on the informed consent process, but the important thing is that the participant should be informed about all the trial processes. We need to see the suitability of the participant, whether the participant will be able to complete all the protocol requirements and follow-ups or not. You have to give time to the participant to make decisions. Undue influence should not be there, and it has to be a voluntary participation. Now, all these processes are documented in the processes, and they are one of the major criteria for monitoring visits, audits, as well as inspections. So many lacunas are found in this informed consent process. So it is the responsibility of the principal investigator that whoever is being delegated that duty should do it diligently. And informed consent process has to be done before any study procedure. And secondly, if some amendment has happened, then reconsenting has to be done. And care has to be taken about the special population, like audiovisual consenting is required for minors and elderly population, so on and so forth. Now, the most important responsibility is to see that the informed consent process has been signed and dated, copy has been provided to the participant, and it has also been filed by the investigator. So this is how the good documentation is done, that the date and time has to be noted. And this should be done at the same time when the consenting is happening and not at a later date or time. And once the participant has been enrolled in the study, we document this in a chronological enrollment order in the screening and enrollment log. Then comes the randomization. But the randomization again has to be according to the protocol. And most of the times now we have online randomizations. And it is the responsibility of the principal investigator to see that the randomization and blinding and masking processes are in place whenever this process is happening. Coming on to the documentation parts, again, the salient features are that we have essential documents and source documents. Now, the source documents are the original documents or data or records which are related to the trial participants. These are the original documents that capture the real-time data or information. Some of the examples of these are, so all these should be available in the participant record files. And this is an example of a source document which is used in one of our clinical trials. Then there are certain essential documents we have about which we have already discussed. These needs to be submitted to the ethics committee and regulators as well. And amongst these essential documents, something about the case record forms, because these are maintained by the investigator as they capture all the necessary data for each participants. And we can have paper or electronic. And during the pandemic time, because of the difficulty, almost all the clinical trials have now shifted to electronic case record forms. And this is something like this, how these electronic case record forms look like. And then data collection. But this is again an important responsibility. If it is not written down, then it has never happened. But the collection of data in clinical trials differs from the usual processes because of the type, amount, and the way the data is archived. So data must be following certain principles, that it should be accurate, legible, at that time only, original, attributable, and complete. And the CRF should match with the source document. So this is a wrong way of entering a data. Again, this is the wrong way. You cannot use a white fluid. The correct way of entering a data is that you strike out if something wrong happens, because human errors do happen. But write the correct data, and it should be signed and dated. Now over here, as you can see that the date is of a later date, because this was one of the findings in the monitoring visit. So whenever the correction happens, at that time you need to document it. And what are some of the consequences of not collecting the data properly? They can be ethical issues. They can be trial issues, like the completion can be delayed. It is an added time for the monitor as well as the investigator. And more importantly, it can jeopardize the reputation of the investigator, and that particular sponsor might not like to work with that investigator at a later date. So IP accountability or investigation product accountability has also been emphasized by Dr. Melvin, and this will be discussed at a later stage also how it is done. But this is one of the important activities. And if some problem happens in this IP accountability, then this is a major deviation in a protocol, which has to be filed. And then accordingly, some repercussions can also happen. And we have to maintain the documentation about the receipt inventory. For example, for vaccines, we have to see how much vaccine was received, what were the storage temperatures, when was the resupply happened. And this is how we maintain the IP accountability log. And again, it has to be in a chronological order. Then safety reporting. The importance of safety reporting again cannot be undermined. All adverse events should be documented, whether expected or unexpected. Serious adverse events should be reported as per the schedules within 24 hours to the Central Licensing Authority, sponsor, and IC, as well as within 24 hours, within 14 days with the complete analysis report. And nowadays, the CDSU is taking online submission of the clinical trial serious adverse events. So the timelines have to be maintained. And another important thing about the compliance with the protocol is standard operating procedures. Now, each site needs to maintain the standard operating procedures. And these are nothing but step-by-step instructions which help us out to carry out specific tasks. So it is a responsibility of the principal investigator to see that all the standard operating procedures for different tasks are in place and has been signed and dated by the principal investigator. And documentation, again, compliance, if there any major deviation happens, it has to be informed to the IEC, approval has to be taken to the sponsor as well as regulatory authorities if required. And then principal investigator is responsible for the trial closeout activities, whatever data has been captured in the electronic case record forms, that has to be cleaned up, sent to the sponsor, and finally, after the trial report is formed, and then it can go for publication. So these are some of the responsibilities of the principal investigators at the clinical trial site. Now, in nutshell, I'll discuss the responsibilities of a monitor. So who is a monitor? Monitor can be a professional, and he's an important resource person, and he's a main line of communication between the sponsor and the investigator. And these are some of the responsibilities of the monitor. I have discussed various responsibilities as the responsibilities of the investigator. Now, the responsibility of the monitor is to see that whatever responsibilities or documentation is being done by the trial site and the trial team, whether it is conforming to the regulatory guidelines or not. So monitor is more of a help to the principal investigator. And I, as a principal investigator, we always welcome monitors because they help us in regulating our data. If there are some mistakes, they are caught, so that we do not face any problems when regulator audits and inspections happen. So for the monitoring visits, the PI and the staff should be available to answer questions. Documents should be available for them for review and source data verification. Space should be provided. We should encourage the monitors to come because they help us in regulating our data and entries according to the good clinical practices. Now, coming on to the responsibilities of a sponsor, I've already discussed. A sponsor is a person is a person or a company who's responsible for initiation, management, and may or may not financing of a clinical trial. Many of the responsibilities, overall responsibility of the trial rise with the sponsor, but the main responsibilities for them is they can finance the project. They have to maintain, they have to provide all the study related documents. They are the one responsible for choosing an investigator and site. They are the ones who take all the regulatory submissions or permissions, and then they generate the termination or study reports, apart from the other common activities which we have discussed with the investigator. In the last, I will just give you a few examples of observations where there's some lapses on the part of the investigators in audits and inspections. There can be non-compliance with the protocol, minor or major, informed consent problems, and inadequate record keeping. Then inadequate processes for communication with the ethics committees. And sometimes PI do not have much time and inadequate oversight by the principal investigator, or inappropriate delegations. And there can be fraud and misconduct. And so what are the regulatory actions which can happen if we do not follow our responsibilities? There can be issue of warning letters, notice of initiation of disqualification proceedings, disqualification as a principal investigator. Criminal investigations can also be instigated in certain situations, and sometimes debarment can also happen if there is a major lapse in fulfillment of the duties. So this is just one small example of submission investigator disqualification where false information was provided. The information provided was that the participant was enrolled in the pediatric study and has completed all the 4 required visits, but the participant's mother informed that the participants did not have that particular infection on the study and did not ever participate in the study. So this was a wrong information provided, and on this basis that particular investigator was disqualified. So we have to be very careful where we are putting our foot. So in the end, to follow our responsibilities, easiest way is to do what is documented and document what you do. And these are some of the references. In the last, it is the teamwork that makes the dream work. And I think one of the important responsibility of an investigator is to choose his team wisely. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Savita, for so you can say lucidly making sure that all salient features are covered here. So I congratulate you on that. In the first question in the chat is whether monitor is mandatory requirement by Dr. Praveen.
Monitor is not a mandatory requirement, but it is always a good practice to have a monitor, because he's one of the key persons which ensures that everything, all the processes are in place and can make the job easy for both the sponsor as well as the principal investigator. So it is always a good idea to have a monitor.
Okay. And there was other things, people are appreciating that your presentations. And few questions. Can monitor be from the IEC by Dr. Anant Kot?
No, IEC is responsible for audits and inspections. Please remember that monitoring is an in-house activity and which is carried out by the people who are the involved people in the clinical trial. Ethics committee and audit is something which is carried out by the third party. So IEC members can do the audit and inspections, but monitor is someone who is actively involved in the clinical trial. So no, ethics committees cannot be part of the monitoring.
Okay, from Dr. Mrinalini, there's a question: does Indian GCP mentions about qualification of monitor?
NDCT rules which are governed at present, no, I think he has to be a professional. They can be a non-medical professional, because till date, whichever monitors I've seen, they are from the pharmacy background commonly. And sir, I'm not aware. I'll check and get it back. I'll definitely check and get back regarding the monitor.
Yeah, a number of studies we have done where the monitor is usually, as such, qualifications are not mentioned. But
they have to be a
look at the
professional.
experience and your prior experience with the clinical trials. Is compensation, Dr. Parveen has another question, is compensation mentioned in the CTA to take responsibility by PI or sponsor?
Yes, compensation and in fact the reimbursement to the participants is mentioned in the CTA also, and it is mandatory for the clinical trials to have insurance policy in place. The CDSU as well as ethics committee do not give permission or approval to any trial where insurance policy is not in place.
Okay, Dr. Purvi Bhagat has a question. Dr. Purvi, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Savita. I just wanted to know how frequently and when does the IEC or its team members the need to audit or assess the site physically?
It depends on the ethics committee, but generally the ethics committee do those trials once in the study duration. Okay. So as per our NDCT requirements, once is more than enough. Audits and inspection generally happens once at a trial site. Monitoring visits happen frequently. They happen at different time points: before the site selection, before the initiation of the study, during the initiation of the study, and also at the site closeout.
Okay. Thank you.
So we'll just take last two questions on the chat. Dr. Mrinalini, would you like to go ahead with your question? Mrinalini, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Ma'am, I just want to know the difference between audit and monitoring.
Okay. Now, monitoring is an in-house process. That means a sponsor chooses a monitor, and obviously the sponsor has interest in that particular trial. So there's a conflict of interest over there if we talk in terms of audit. Now, audits, it is something which is done by a third party, an independent party who does not have any conflict of interest with that particular research study or clinical trial. So the audits and inspection are generally done by the regulatory authorities. And monitoring visit is generally monitors are hired by the sponsors and they are paid by the sponsors to have, so that all the documentation and the processes which are happening in that clinical trial site are as per the regulatory guidelines. Because if something goes wrong, then obviously the compensation has to be paid by the sponsor. So obviously, so it is an in-house arrangement.
So
thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, we'll take a last question from Dr. Mahindra Eka. Sir, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sir, my question is, the madam showed that there is a bond paper in which take an agreement for the clinical trial. So it is mandatory to take from every participant, or informed consent is sufficient?
The clinical trial agreement is an agreement or a legal document between the stakeholders, major at the site, between the institution, the sponsor, and the principal investigator. And if the sponsor hires a CRO, then it can be between all four of them. So it is a clinical trial agreement which is bounding on the sponsor, investigator, as well as institution. As far as the subject or participants are concerned, the informed consent document is sufficient.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Savita. I hand over to Dr.
Sir.
Ganesh.
Thank you, sir. Now we are heading towards the end of the today's session. I am very thankful to all office bearers of NPT for allowing us to conduct this workshop, as well as both the speakers for their excellent presentation and well moderation done by the Dr. Bhomik sir and Badiyal sir. Lastly, my sincere thanks to all participants for their active participation as well as patience hearing. With this now, I declare that today's session is over and we will meet again on 10th March at 3 p.m. Thank you all. Both these PPT will be shared to all participants within 4 to 5 days to their respective emails. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We close the session now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.